the notion of privacy. And the state is mandated under various dominant ideologies: free market, small government, individual liberty, family privacy, efficiency, to be restrained, not to intervene or interfere with the innovation of the market or the magic of the family. So one scholarly task is to show how the myriad ways in which the state creates, maintains, supports, and subsidizes these institutions, public and private, through its laws and policies. And to do this, we look at tax, corporate, and finance law, as well as family and poverty law. Further, the argument must be made that considering the role and significance of these institutions to individuals and to society, it is imperative that they be effectively monitored and regulated. And here we need to develop links between institutional actions and the possibility of societal harm, reflecting a sense, or building a sense of institutional responsibility. And incidentally, this should not be hard. These institutions can and have generated massive crises that affect us all. They are vulnerable as human creations to act inequitably, to capture corruption, decay, and failure. And we must articulate a sense of state responsibility for the operation of these institutions that is anchored in the concept of social contract. Respect the idea that the state is in relationship with individuals, and recognize that the individual in that relationship is the vulnerable subject. This means that the scope of state responsibility must go well beyond merely defining and ferreting out impermissible discrimination in access or operation against select groups, as we currently do with equal protection and anti-discrimination laws. Rather, our inquiry into state responsibility must also encompass the broader, more inclusive obligation for the state to give due regard, to be equally concerned with the complete range of capabilities and dependencies that can and do occur across the human life course of all individuals. And our notion of what constitutes an injury by the state, a violation by the state of the social contract, should include neglect or willful ignorance of the circumstances of gross inequality, substantial deprivation, and unmet need. The policies and laws of an adequately responsive state must address the range of dependencies inherent over the life course, be attentive to all stages of development and forms of need. Remaining question: how does state responsibility be defined and implemented under a vulnerability analysis? This is a big question, but I do have some preliminary suggestions. First, the responsive state must ensure that there is equity and parity in its subsidy and support of institutions. And this does not mean equal support. Rather, the state has to invest so that institutions are equivalently equipped in their ability to provide for all individuals to gain the necessary resilience and resources over the life course. Differential funding for schools and hospitals and so on would be based on superior need, not the wealth of the neighborhood or the wealth of the consumer or the things like property taxes. Second, we may also see a need for a more substantial subsidy for those classes or categories of institution that organize early life and are foundational in the building of resilience. And here, this would be particularly the family and education. Also, perhaps superior resources should be directed to those institutions responsive to the stages of life where vulnerability is most apparent or when it's realized in dependency on care. But third, and most important, for me at least right now, is looking at the relationships within institutions from a vulnerability perspective. The state in making policy would have to recognize there is an unrealized need to be diligent in monitoring the functioning and structure of its institutions and ensure that laws that regulate these institutions are sensitive to the fact that they do confer privilege and advantage. Here, among other things, I'm concerned with the ways in which institutional practices, priorities, values, and norms produce various social identities and relationships, and the way that those identities interact and complicate or facilitate resilience. And what I put in here were just some of the relationships: employer-employee, parent-child, debtor-creditor, teacher-student. You could add others: shareholder-directors, consumer-manufacturer. We could go through dozens and dozens of relationships that are created, responsibilities, privilege and disadvantage created by law. The imbalance of power and privilege within these social relationships operate to exclude and subordinate individuals independent of, even if in addition to personal characteristics such as gender and race. These social identities are arrangements of privilege and of power, which are also reflected and enshrined in law. They are also often based on unrealistic and incomplete conceptions of the needs and capacities of actual human beings who are caught up within these social situations. For example, family privacy and parental rights are based on the legal fiction that all parents are always best informed as to their children's needs and always act in their children's best interests. This fiction can lead to policies that not only erode public responsibility for children, but can operate in ways that shield possible detrimental parental actions and decisions from public scrutiny and interference. So too, the myths of freedom and autonomy shape the legal meaning and implications of the employment contract, obscuring imbalances in bargaining power and permitting the employer to impose what is essentially a contract of adhesion on the terms that they alone determine. These relationships should be more regulated, some recognized as intimate, inescapable, intense relationships, and also there should be a need to reconcile the work and family roles for the states within these relationships. The state fails the vulnerable subject in not responding to and correcting imbalances in power within these relationships, or at least explaining why that imbalance of power should be reinforced as it is in law. What's the role of law in that? So to sum up, the conception of the legal subject as an autonomous and independent being whose primary demand is for liberty and freedom from an essentially threatening, potentially interventionist state is a prototype for the legal subject that has to be confronted and contested. And I believe the concept of the vulnerable legal subject has the power to disrupt the logic of individual choice and personal responsibility built on this liberal stereotype. It does so by articulating a more inclusive and realistic legal subject, one that makes it clear that there is an injury or injustice inevitably arising from a state unresponsive to vulnerability and dependency. It also dismantles the notion of independence on both an individual and an institutional level. Okay, this is my last slide. This is for those of you who are uncomfortable with the idea of an active state. I leave you with two competing images. We have the responsive state, which is labeled the utopian vision, and the restrained state, which I labeled dystopian. And my argument is that the state is necessary because law is necessary, and because we don't want either international corporations or a Hobbesian anarchy to form the rules and values that shape our society. And because our social institutions are vitally important to the individuals and to society, but themselves are vulnerable, there can be no neutral or inactive state. Those institutions must be monitored. Laws are the recognition that all human endeavors are social endeavors. As such, they require rules setting out concurrent duties and responsibilities to guide living and working together harmoniously and productively. It seems obvious that those institutions that we create should be responsive to vulnerability, and we must work to ensure that they are. Thank you.